we're going to begin. If we could kind of, and you please feel free to move a little bit forward if you like. We will be starting right now. And on behalf of the Board of Directors of the National Endowment for Democracy, I'm delighted to welcome you to our annual Democracy Award presentation. My name is Martin Frost. I'm a former congressman from Texas, and I serve as NED's chairman. Since 1987, we have honored outstanding men and women throughout the world who have devoted their lives to advocacy and activism on behalf of the twin causes of democracy and freedom. Let me begin by thanking the sponsors for this evening's event. My NED board colleague, Ambassador Robert Tuttle, and the Hereford Foundation. We deeply appreciate their longtime support for our work, and we encourage you to take note in your program of all those who have contributed so generously. Next week marks the 25th anniversary of the shooting of unarmed, peaceful, pro-democracy demonstrators in China's Tiananmen Square. To mark the occasion, my NED colleagues and I are honoring two remarkable individuals who have advocated for constitutional democracy for their country. Unfortunately, they will not be here personally to accept the honor they have so richly earned. Since the regime in Beijing has chosen to silence their voices, we are here to make sure that these voices are heard loud and clear. We're also here to pay tribute to someone who needs no assistance in making his voice heard on behalf of human rights. Tonight, we will honor my former House colleague, who's still serving in the House, Frank Wolf, with NED's Democracy Service Medal, putting him in the company of such luminaries as His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Václav Havel, and our late House colleague, Tom Lantos. Frank has announced that he will retire from the House at the end of the current Congress, and we can only hope that he will not retire from speaking out against injustice and persecution, which has become his trademark. On behalf, our leadoff speaker this evening needs no introduction to Washington's human rights community. For over a decade, Tom Malinowski has championed the cause as Washington Director of Human Rights Watch. He was sworn in only a couple of weeks ago as the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And I'm pleased to invite him to come forward to offer some remarks. Tom?
Thank you, everyone. Glad I arrived just in time for my introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming out for this incredibly important event. Thank you, Carl, for hosting us and for bestowing these important awards every single year. I wish Frank Wolf was here because I wanted to pay tribute to him as well. But he is one of our great friends and allies in this cause, whether we're talking about Tibetans in China, Baha'is in Iran, Copts in Egypt, Kurds, Cubans, Vietnamese, Sudanese, so many others. A member of Congress who counts his achievements not just in votes cast and legislation passed, but in dissidents not in prison and atrocities not committed around the world. And that's a rare and wonderful thing. As the award that you give out is a replica of the goddess of democracy, it's appropriate that we focus on China today and remember those tragic events in Tiananmen 25 years ago. I remember them very vividly, particularly when I'm up in the Hill, because when it happened, I was a very young legislative aide for the late, great Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, sitting in the Russell Building. And we had TVs in our offices, even back in those Stone Age days. And there was this channel that we almost never watched back then, called CNN. It was new. It was this, there was C-SPAN and then there was this CNN thing. Until one day, we looked up at our screens and we were mesmerized by this image of a young man stopping tanks with a wave of his hand. It was really the first time in history that one part of the world watched history unfold in real time in another part of the world. And we've been doing that ever since. So that's one legacy of Tiananmen, one way in which it changed the entire world. We all know what happened next, but we also know that the drama did not end on June 4th. Since then, China has changed in so many ways. It's built a modern economy, it's lifted people out of poverty, it's become an influential power, a partner on many issues that we care about. Yet many of the people who stood on the square that day asking only for the freedom to speak their minds and have a say are still harassed. Others are still unaccounted for. A strong and confident country should be able to come to terms with the painful parts of its past. China should provide the fullest possible accounting of what happened 25 years ago and stop retribution against those who simply wish to remember and debate it. If there's still any disagreement on what I just said, it is not between the Chinese and American people. It is only between the Chinese and American governments. As Zhiyong, one of today's two honorees, said in the closing statement at his trial last year, democratic values are rooted in common humanity. They should not be Eastern or Western, socialist or capitalist, but universal to all human societies. Zhiyong worked for a set of goals that the Chinese government says it supports: respect for Chinese law, institutions accountable to the people, an end to corruption. Yet for this, he is in prison. Xiaobo is in prison for drafting a document, a charter calling for basic democratic freedoms enjoyed by people in every part of the world. His wife is under house arrest. A strong and confident country does not fear such people. It sees them as a source of strength. In this spirit, we urge Chinese authorities to release Liu Xiaobo, Xu Zhiyong, and other members of China's New Citizens Movement, and to guarantee the Chinese people the internationally recognized rights and freedoms that all people deserve. We ask for this not just because it's right. As National Security Advisor Susan Rice recently said, when courts imprison political dissidents who merely urge respect for China's own laws, no one in China, including Americans doing business there, can feel secure. When ethnic and religious minorities, such as Tibetans and Uyghurs, are denied their fundamental freedoms, the trust that holds diverse societies together is undermined. In other words, as China grows more integrated with the world, its economic, its environmental, its security problems become our problems too. And those kinds of problems only get solved when governments allow civil society to flourish, and judges to judge, and journalists to write, and people to communicate freely without interference of political leaders. While it's the Chinese people who have the most to gain by seeing those things happen, we have enormous stake in America as well. In his statement to the Chinese court that convicted him in 2009 and that was later read at the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony the following year, Liu Xiaobo wrote, 20 years have passed, but the ghosts of June 4th have not yet been laid to rest. The enormous effort the Chinese government makes to suppress the memory of that event only proves one thing: how much ordinary Chinese people still insist on discussing it, and how much they want not just to remember the past, but to shape their future. So long as they ask for that basic right, the United States will continue to stand with them. It's in our nature, and it's in our interest. Thank you.
And now to set the stage for tonight's award presentation, I would like to call your attention to the screen for a brief video.
When 89 movement started, Liu Xiaobo at the time was at Columbia University, and he went back to China. He went straight to the Tiananmen Square, and he joined the movement. Liu Xiaobo has, from the very beginning, very clear about staying inside China to do what he did, not living in exile. He said if you're not prepared to go to prison, well, stop challenging the Communist Party's rule. The signatories of Charter OA are not a political party, but they are the first gathering and lineup of China's politically active citizens who want to change China into a democracy. Since Liu Xiaobo's arrest, really the signatories of Charter OA have been the most active Chinese citizens to promote change in China. Charter OA and the New Citizens Movement are the two most important movements to promote China towards democracy. May 2012, Dr. Zhiyong quietly published in his blog an essay called China's New Citizens Movement, in which he laid out the New Citizens Movement. He said that it is at the same time a political, social, and cultural movement. In essence, the New Citizens Movement is asking citizens to do what they ought to be doing. They ought to assume their responsibilities as citizens. They ought to exercise their political and civil rights as citizens. Today, Liu Xiaobo and Xu Zhiyong are awarded the Democracy Award for their work. These are two leaders of China's democracy movement. They are leaders in a time where being a leader means sacrifices and paying prices, high prices. And they're leaders because their sense of a moral imperative and sense of a mission. I'm happy that their work is recognized, but I'm also very sad because some of China's brightest and the most courageous men are in prison. That is a shame for China and for the Chinese people wherever they are. And by extension, it's a shame for the international community too.
Okay, as we roll the credits, I would like y'all to ask you to move forward because we're opening up the doors behind you and we need a little space there. But so if some of you could move forward, that would be helpful. It is now my pleasure to call upon my NED board colleague, Professor Andrew Nathan of Columbia, one of our country's leading experts on China, to make this evening's first presentation. Andy?
Thank you, Martin. Tonight, the National Endowment for Democracy pays tribute to Xu Zhiyong, who cannot be here tonight because he's in jail with a 4-year sentence for, quote, gathering a crowd to disrupt public order. So I'd like to invite Xu Zhiyong's good friend Hua Zi to come up to the podium and to receive the award on his behalf. Hua Zi is a former documentary filmmaker from China who now runs an organization called China Rights in Action, which does very effective work for the human rights activists in China in many different ways. And Hua Zi has co-edited an interesting book that I recommend to you with a title that the publisher gave it. It's not a very good title, called In the Shadow of the Rising Dragon. And the book includes the stories of various people who've been kidnapped by the Chinese political police and detained for periods of time, including Hua Zi herself, who was detained for a couple of months, and her story is in here, and it's a very frightening story. Why is the NED honoring Xu Zhiyong? First, I want to make clear that Xu Zhiyong is actually not a grantee of the NED, and the reason for that is that he believes in supporting his activities with financial support from within China. Since he received his Doctor of Laws degree in China in 2002, he's been continuously fighting for civil rights in China. He's done many important things. I only have time to mention a few of them. Number one, he started a campaign for equal access to education, which is a problem that affects the children of migrant workers who have gone to the cities and brought their children. Those children did not have equal access to education. He did this by gathering signatures to support access for those children. This is a very unusual thing in China, where it's very hard to get broad-based public support for any kind of public issue because people are afraid and they're surveilled by the police and they're subject to police violence. Xu Zhiyong persisted in this. He gathered names, 100,000, and had an effect on this issue so that today it's helped to break down this apartheid against the children of rural migrants to the cities. A second example of what he has done is that he has fought for the petitioners in Beijing, the people who come to Beijing from all over the country to seek justice. He went and lived in their ghetto in Beijing for 2 months to see what kind of life they led. He was attacked by goons and physically assaulted, but he persisted. He finally filed a report on the petitioning system, which had a big impact on improving that system and helping to protect the petitioners from attacks by government thugs. A third activity of Xu Zhiyong was to expose the black jails system by which people who came to Beijing to seek justice were rounded up by police from the localities and stuck in these black jails and mistreated before being sent home. He exposed that system in many places and helped to reduce the use of that system. A fourth example is that he's one of the few Han Chinese who has looked into the problem of the Tibetan people and how they feel about the way that they are treated, and has tried to understand the situation of the Tibetans and has written about the bankruptcy of the government's policy in Tibet. And the final thing I want to mention is that Xu Zhiyong, building on all of these activities, founded something called the Open Constitution Initiative to ask the government to live by its own constitution, and then founded a movement called the New Citizens Movement, which asks the Chinese citizens to behave as citizens and to improve themselves as citizens regardless of how the government itself may behave. Besides Huazi, I want to identify some people who are here who are supporters and participants of this New Citizens Movement. I want to recognize the family members of 2 members of the New Citizens Movement who are currently imprisoned in China. So first of all, I want to identify Professor Luo Shengchun. Is she here? Where is she? Raise your hand. Thank you. And she is the wife of Professor Ding Jiaxi, who is a lawyer who was detained. Okay, you've also been kidnapped. Who was detained on May 3rd. And then I want to recognize Professor He Xiaolian, whose husband is a writer who is detained, whose name is Li Huaping. Also, Xiao Guozhen, where are you? Oh, there she is taking pictures. Xiao Guozhen is a rights defense lawyer from China who is currently a democracy fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy. And we just saw Cao Yaxue on the screen. She is here as well, who maintains a website called ChinaChange.org that I recommend to all of you. That's very, very useful. To return to Xu Zhiyong, the reason that he's in jail, as I said, is that all of the things I've described, his work for the petitioners, his work to try to create a citizens movement and so forth, are exactly the kind of things that the Chinese government has designated as, quote, gathering a crowd to disrupt public order. In our view, in the view of NED, though, the activities of Xu Zhiyong are not and should not be a crime, but they are actually the model of the most beneficial types of activities that a citizen in China could take to build a sustainable and stable public order in China. His activities are exactly the kind of activities that NED tries to support all around the world for peaceful, lawful change that will build stable democracies and rule of law. So for Xu Zhiyong's intellectual integrity, for his courage, for his belief in a free and democratic China, the National Endowment for Democracy is proud to present its 2014 Democracy Award to Xu Zhiyong. You can also put it there.
I'm honored to be here on behalf of my friend Xu Zhiyong, the recipient of this great honor. What should have been a joyous occasion, however, leaves me with a feeling of great sadness. This very moment, Zhiyong is serving a prison sentence in China. About weeks before, the court issued the verdict which landed him in prison. His daughter was born. Not only was Zhiyong unable to see her and birth, he's also going to miss out on being there for her and watching her grow up for the next several years. Over the last decade, Zhiyong worked tremendously hard for social justice in China and paid a cost commensurate to his achievement. In 2003, he and two other scholars, Teng Biao and Yu Jiang, helped free hundreds of millions of migrant workers from the constant fear of arbitrary detention and getting sent back to the countryside, through limiting the unconstitutional use of police power. Xu Zhiyong fought for freedom of many Chinese and lost his own freedom over and over. He has already been arrested twice, and beatings, abductions, forced disappearances, and house arrest hunted him every stop of the way. Zhu once said, "Prison is the path a nation must walk toward freedom." From Liu Xiaobo to Xu Zhiyong, Chinese human rights defenders are traveling down this honorable and lonely road undeterred. I'm sorry to see this is still happening, starting with the crackdown on the New Citizens Movement and the latest wave of widespread criminal detention of scholars, lawyers, writers, and activists. We have clear evidence a large human rights crisis is happening in China. I want to end by thanking the National Endowment for Democracy for giving the award to Xu Zhiyong. I firmly believe that democracy and freedom in China required a working and hard work of countless Chinese people, as well as the attention and the support of the international community. As stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, recognition of inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundations of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Thank you very much.
As a former member of Congress, I am particularly sensitive to the congressional schedule. Frank is managing a bill on the floor right now, and there are some votes scheduled to start in about 20 minutes or so, 25. So we're going to move rather quickly, and we may not go exactly according to the schedule as printed, but we do want to make sure Frank is here when we make the presentation. We have several members who want to say something about Frank. And I think what Carl, with your indulgence, I think we will go to the presentation to Frank and then do the final presentation that you will be doing, because I want to make sure Frank is here and can fully be applauded by this group and recognized by this group. There are several members. Vin Weber is going to make the actual remarks, but there are a couple of other members. I know that Joe Pitts is here, and I believe that McGovern is here. And what I'd like to do, I'd like to call on Jim McGovern, my former colleague on the Rules Committee, to make some remarks, and then call upon Joe Pitts. And I don't know if there are any other members, current members, who are here, and then we'll go to Vin, but we do want to make sure that Frank, we have enough time to honor Frank. Jim?
Well, thank you very much, and let me thank everybody with NED for all of the incredible work that you do on behalf of human rights. And I had the honor to be with Nancy Pelosi and with Speaker Boehner today, with many of the human rights defenders from China, as we commemorated the 25th anniversary of the terrible tragedy at Tiananmen Square. What an honor it was for me to be with everybody. But I want to thank NED in particular for honoring my colleague Frank Wolf today. I'm a liberal Democrat from Massachusetts, but if I lived in Northern Virginia, I probably would vote for Frank Wolf. That is how much I respect and admire him. I have learned a lot from him about the importance of human rights. I have seen him as his heart has bled when people have come before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, where he and I co-chair, and listening to stories of human rights defenders who have been persecuted in their homeland because of who they are, because of what they believe, because of how they worship. And I have also seen Frank Wolf tear witnesses. It has been a real privilege to have had the opportunity to serve in Congress with Frank, to be on the Human Rights Commission with Frank. He's a man with a very tender heart, but a spine of steel. And for all of his work, it is appropriate that NED give him this recognition tonight, their service medal. And I just want to be part of the group of people up here, the chorus, that says to Frank, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you.
And I'd next like to recognize Congressman Joe Pitts, a principled and effective advocate for human rights around the world. Congressman Joe Pitts from Pennsylvania has worked with Congressman Wolf on many issues, including Sudan and Vietnam. Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the National Endowment for Democracy for giving this award to Frank Wolf. And thank you to all the human rights champions that are represented in this room for the work you do. You're my heroes. Frank has been one of my very best friends in Washington for my 18 years in Congress. In fact, every week, Frank and Tony Hall, former member from Ohio, Democrat and former ambassador to the UN for Food and Agriculture Affairs, and I have met every week together for 18 years. So we are close friends. We've traveled together. We were the first group to go to Afghanistan in January 1, 2002, after the hostilities changed there. And while we were there, a couple of the senators flew into Bagram Airfield, and they summoned Karzai to Bagram, wouldn't travel to Kabul like we did, and announced that they were the first group. But at any rate, we've done a lot of things together. I probably shouldn't tell some of these things, but for a member of Congress, it's very tempting to focus on issues that get you votes and raise you money. But Frank and I both have the same weakness. Some of the things we really care about: raise us no money, get us no votes, produce no kudos from the folks back home. And my constituents probably couldn't tell you a thing about the refugee camps near Tindouf, Algeria. I've been there several times and advocated on behalf of the refugees in the refugee camps. And Frank is the same way. He deeply cares about people suffering in other parts of the world, some in forgotten corners, and is really a champion for places like human rights in Sudan and China. And we look to Frank for leadership in a lot of these areas. He's savvy enough to know that relationships are the way to make long-term changes, and sometimes that means sitting down and talking to the bad guys. You may remember a few years ago, I don't know if former Speaker Nancy Pelosi's here yet or not, but when she went to Syria, she received a lot of criticism for meeting with Assad, and that was before the Civil War, before his reputation wasn't much better. It wasn't much better then, but she went. It produced an uproar. Well, let me tell you a little secret. Frank and I believe Tony, were there the week before and met with Assad. We weren't representing, we weren't the speaker or representing the State Department. We were just Americans trying to open up a little bit of opportunity to speak on behalf of democracy and trying to get them to stop being a haven for terrorists going into Iraq. And if you see a picture of us with Assad, you'll notice that Frank and I, the other members, are scowling. We're not smiling. We didn't want to smile in a photo with him because Assad is a brutal dictator. But my point is, Frank Wolf was willing to try. And we tried to make some headway, and Frank defended the Speaker Pelosi, when she was criticized. He's that kind of a person. So, at any rate, he works to make the world a better place, and he cares for the right things for the right reasons. So, thank you. Well done, Frank. You're good and faithful public servants, and in 1,000 small ways, and no doubt a few big ways, the world's a better place because of your work, and it's an honor to serve along with you. Congratulations, and thank you for recognizing me.
Next, I would like to call forward Vin Weber. Vin is the current vice chair of the board and a previous chair of the board of NED. The chairmanship rotates depending upon which party is in the White House.
I thought it was on merit.
Since it's on merit also. And so when there was a Republican president, Vin was the chair, and there's a Democratic president. I'm now honored to serve as chair. Vin Weber.
Thank you very much, Martin. And Martin's doing a great job as chair. I think it was a rotation on merit, whether it was planned that way or not. Welcome, everybody. I would just like to say 34, if I have to date myself, 34 years ago, I was elected to Congress. Frank Wolf and I were elected together, dragging Ronald Reagan into the White House on our coattails. and I've never been prouder to be able to stand up and say a few words on behalf of a member of Congress than I have of my friend Frank Wolf. 6 years ago, when I was still the chairman of the NED, we honored a group of Chinese human rights lawyers courageously battling religious and other forms of persecution. Frank spoke movingly at that event about the evils of religious persecution in China, and this was a time at which we were all sort of in a gung-ho mood about our relationship with China, and then decided quite characteristically to put his words into action. Shortly after that ceremony, he and our colleague Chris Smith, also elected in that first election of 1980, traveled to Beijing, where they sought out the recipients in order to present them with their awards in person. They were denied by the authorities, but the message of encouragement and solidarity that they sent to their fellow activists could not have been clearer or more reassuring. Frank has faithfully represented the 10th District of of Virginia for 34 years. I know that it's Virginia, Frank. I really do. For 34 years. During that time, he has also been responsible for many important achievements at the national level on scientific research, cybersecurity, and putting our country's fiscal problems in order. But his true imprint has been his remarkable commitment to speaking out on behalf of oppressed peoples everywhere. Joe Pitts said it better than I could have. As did Tom Malinowski, as did Jim McGovern, that Frank has devoted himself to a cause truly larger than himself. In 1998, he authored the International Religious Freedom Act, which created the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and established the International Religious Freedom Office at the State Department. And as Jim McGovern mentioned, he continues to co-chair the Lantos Human Rights Commission. Let me just say, finally, as a former member, it gives me a good deal of pain to note that the Congress of the United States, which should be in and of itself an enormous advertisement for democracy to people around the world, is held in, as the old saying goes, minimum high regard in the United States these days. I don't laugh at the late night jokes about Congress's low approval rating or at the cable TV shows that make a living about making fun of the Congress of the United States. And I don't take any satisfaction in the fact that the American people seem to have lost a lot of confidence in this institution. But the solution is not in any specific change in the processes of Congress. The solution is to get the American people to understand the life and career of some of their members. The best example of which I can possibly think of is Frank Wolf, someone who has dedicated his entire life to things beyond himself, things that did not get him campaign contributions or votes, as Joe Pitts said, or accrue to the accrual of power in Washington, D.C., but tried to make the lives of people who are suffering around the world better. He is an example of democracy at its best, of government at its best, of the United States of America at its best. And for his unflagging determination to bear witness to human rights abuses in the most remote corners of the world, the National Endowment for Democracy is honored to present its Democracy Service Medal to Congressman Frank Wolf. You want to wear it? Why not? I'd wear it. Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank Vin and Martin. I want to thank Carl. I want to thank Ned for the award and for any of the comments that were made. I apologize. We are over on the floor, and I appreciate you moving and changing the schedule around. I also want to thank the recipients. You know, I really don't feel worthy of it, to be honest with you. Madam Speaker, would you like to? Okay. But the people who you are honoring and the other freedom lovers and dissidents are really like Sharansky and Sakharov and Elena Bonner and Solzhenitsyn. They are the modern ones. So I want to, it's an honor to be even in their company, to be in the same room. I am moved by that company of the democracy awardees, individuals who have suffered greatly and in fact languish unjustly in prison as I speak, for daring to dream of a China where basic human rights and fundamental freedoms are respected and realized. As has been noted, this evening's gathering falls within days of the 25th anniversary of Tiananmen Square. Nearly a quarter of a century, a student-led pro-democracy protest drew more than 1 million people to Tiananmen. At the time, and most certainly in hindsight, it appears that this spontaneous, citizen-led movement for greater openness and transparency and the rule of law could have marked the beginning of a peaceful political transition in China. But that brief moment of opportunity was lost. By nearly every measure, China is today as intolerant of dissent as it has ever been, as evidenced by the stories you have heard and you have read. Perhaps the most familiar image from the crackdown is a photo, and former Speaker Pelosi, Democratic leader, referenced it on the floor yesterday, scarred in the minds of the citizens of the tank man who stood in front of the tanks. We don't know if the tank man is dead. We don't know if he's alive. We don't know where he is. But Speaker Pelosi on the floor yesterday had that picture, which I believe was on the cover of Time magazine. On June 6, 1989, the New York Times published a piece that began, quote, "It all started with a man in a white shirt who walked into the street, raised his right hand no higher than a New Yorker hailing a taxi." The New York Times headline for that article was, quote, "Crackdown in Beijing, one man can make a difference. This one jousted briefly with Goliath." The headline reminded me of a book I recently read by Malcolm Gladwell, David and Goliath, Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants. The book features a chapter on the American Civil Rights Movement and an equally memorable photo from May 1963 of a young teenage boy apparently being attacked by a police dog in Birmingham, Alabama. Gladwell's book describes in fascinating detail how Martin Luther King and fellow civil rights leaders chose Birmingham for the next protest in their struggle against segregation because they knew that the city's racist public safety commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor, was likely to overreact to the peaceful protest and in doing so galvanize a national public outrage for the burgeoning movement. This iconic American image awakened the national consciousness to the injustice of segregation and related racist laws. Sadly, the same cannot be said of the Tank Man. Widely seen in the West, the photo failed to have a meaningful impact on U.S. foreign policy. Year after year, in Republican and Democratic administrations alike, the U.S.-China relationship has paid only lip service to human rights and religious freedom. And yet the Chinese government has never provided a comprehensive accounting of those killed, maimed, and detained during the brutal crackdown a quarter century ago. The government's response to Tiananmen is consistent with its authoritarian impulses still we see today. China's consistently silent dissident represses religious believers of every faith and stifles opposition. And yet, in the face of China's draconian assault on basic human liberty, millions of Chinese people continue to long for and courageously act in pursuit of freedom and basic human dignity. These impulses are captured by the simultaneously tragic and inspiring biographies of this evening's Democracy Award recipients. Today, a bipartisan group of lawmakers, and I appreciate the Democratic leader joining, sent a letter to the D.C. mayor and city council requesting that the section of International Place that runs past the Chinese embassy in Washington be named after Dr. Liu Xiaobo. And there is precedent for such action. In the 1980s, the square in front of the Soviet embassy in Washington was renamed Sakharov Plaza after anti-Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov. Some may argue that this is purely a symbolic gesture, but symbols have power. The Tiananmen Square demonstrators of 25 years ago understood that symbols speak volumes. They carried the papier-mâché models of the goddess of democracy, precisely because of what it represented. The art students who created the sculpture explain as much in their declaration when you read it. They said, "You are the symbol of every student in the square, of the hearts of millions of people today in the People's Square. The people's goddess stands tall and announces to the whole world a consciousness of democracy has awakened the Chinese people. Indeed, a consciousness was awakened that day. And while the flame has flickered at times in the face of darkness, it has proceeded and persisted." The men honored here tonight, and the countless others, the women and the countless others who have risked their lives, you come back from a trip there and you feel so insufficient because you're meeting with giants. It's like when you would come back from Moscow and you would meet and talk to a Sharansky or something like that. These people really put everything on the line. They honored here tonight and countless others. Individuals whose names we unfortunately will never know have guaranteed as much. Against all odds, they've continued to battle Goliath. And we know how that story ends. I pray for the day that the Chinese government, the party and the system responsible for Tiananmen and continued repression will be relegated to the ash heap of history. And you know, for years after my first trip behind the Iron Curtain, I would pray for the fall of the Soviet Union. Every night, I pray for a peaceful fall of the Chinese government. And I believe it will come in my lifetime if the democratic aspirations of the Chinese people can find a champion in the United States of America. Again, I thank Ned, I thank Vin and Martin, and Joe and Jim and Carl, and I'm speaking to you every time, and I remember Tiananmen, you were there. I want to thank you for everything you've always done. God bless you, and thank you very much for the work.
I want to thank my speaker, Nancy Pelosi, for being here. And Carl is going to make some very brief remarks, and then we're going to have Nancy come forward. We had to flip our schedule just a little bit, and I appreciate your forbearance. Carl.
Thank you, Martin. And if people are in the back and you want to come up, either the front can move forward or people in the back can squeeze through so people can, we have a little bit of room up in front. And Frank, I want you to know that we have a poster there. It's a Thank Frank poster. We're launching a hashtag, Thank Frank. You can tweet messages if you want, expressing your appreciation, and you can sign that poster after the event. And Frank, you can have that. That's our gift, in addition to the medal. And I also just want to say what a great honor it is to have Cheng Wang-Chen here with us. It's just been so superb. I want to give him a whole. I was with Nancy Pelosi and many others who are with us today on December the 10th, 2010 in Oslo, when Liu Xiaobo was presented with the Nobel Peace Prize in absentia because, of course, he was in prison. It was the first time since 1936 that no one was present to accept the prize. The occasion is vividly engraved in our memories. The massive audience rising in repeated standing ovations as Lee Woolman read from the closing statement at Liu's trial, "I have no enemies," with his empty chair of honor constituting a powerful indictment of the regime that had imprisoned him and that continues to imprison him. The most moving passage in Liu's statement was about his wife, Liu Xia, whose love he called the sunlight that leaps over high walls and penetrates the iron bars of my prison window. Liu Xia could not be in Oslo to receive the prize on her husband's behalf because she herself had been placed under house arrest. She has remained in the punishing isolation of house arrest since the prize was awarded, and the government's method of collective punishment has extended even to her family members. One of her brothers last year received an 11-year prison sentence on a politically motivated, trumped-up charge of economic fraud. Today, we are very pleased to have with us one of Liu Xia's nephews, Liu Xiaobo. He has a short message, a very, very short message for the occasion from Liu Xia and Liu Xiaobo, and I'd like to call upon him now to read it, please. Okay. Okay, well. Okay.
Unfortunately, the tyranny of the bells, now nothing compared to the tyranny in the Chinese government, but nonetheless dictating that I have to unfortunately go to the floor. And you do too, Frank, and you do too. So let me just thank Carl for giving me the privilege of intervening here as the award is given to Liu Xiaobo. Carl, thank you for your great leadership. Martin, Vin, Frank, my inspiration. Anytime you feel desperate and think, is this possible, you just listen to Frank Wolf, and you know that the fight must go on, and the inspiration and the strength and the prayers are there. Thank you for your courage, Frank Wolf, and thank you for your leadership. It is an honor to call you colleague, a pleasure to call you friend. Where we're supposed to be right now is that Carl was going to make this wonderful statement about Liu Xiaobo, which he will continue to make. I will yield back to him. It was an honor to be there in Norway, in Oslo. As part of the delegation, we were chosen by the family to be there, as Liu Xiaobo was not allowed to be there. I want the other honoree, Zhiyong. I salute him, founders of the New Citizens Movement, and unfortunately, he cannot be here, but Zhiyong, Hui Zhu, his friend, now where is he, was here to receive the honor for him. Okay, so let me say, this is not the first time that Liu has been unable to claim an award recognizing his courage and strength. As was mentioned by Carl, Liu continues to sit in a Chinese prison for his role as an organizer and signer of Charter 08, We are reminded of an empty chair in Oslo. It was, whatever the Chinese government thought they were doing, it backfired, because it was a scene that went round the world, that this man would be so honored with the Nobel Prize, a prize that had been received by Elie Wiesel, Mother Teresa, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Nelson Mandela, Dr. Martin Luther King. The list of champions goes on and on. He was in their company, they were in his company, and he could not be there. It was a seat that the Chinese government refused to allow him to fill. And now, then as now, Liu's absence could not be silenced because of the power of his ideas. As Liu once proclaimed, freedom of expression is the foundation of human rights, the source of humanity, the mother of truth. To strangle freedom of speech is to trample on human rights, stifle humanity, and suppress truth. And as Carl said, Lee Woolman read his statement, "I have no enemies and no hatred," he said, of those who imprisoned him. I hope to be able to transcend my personal experiences to counter the regime's hostility with utmost goodwill and dispel hatred with love. Wow, Frank, that's something. These statements are a definition of compassion and character and strength, a reflection that no empty chair can suppress the will of Liu Xiaobo and all who yearn for freedom. Carl has already talked about Liu Xia, Liu's wife. Chinese officials abuse and intimidate the families of human rights activists with impunity and without conscience, as we know from some who are with us here today. As we continue to work for Liu's release, we must continue to speak out for Liu Xia's as well. Since her husband received the Nobel Prize in 2010, Chinese authorities have confined her to one-bedroom apartment with no contact with the outside. Making matters worse, her physical and mental health it does not improve under those circumstances, and her brother, as has been mentioned, was recently sentenced to 11 years in prison. Apparently, it is a crime in China to be married to a Nobel laureate. As a minimum, she should be released on humanitarian grounds to seek medical treatment abroad. As we mark the 25th anniversary, as we all did earlier today and yesterday on the floor of the House, and will continue until next week, remember all those who have left empty chairs because they stood up and spoke out against the abuses of the Chinese government, whether it was about abuses in China or in Tibet. 25 years later, can you believe, Frank, 25 years we've been making this fight? 25 years later, their spirit and their inspiration endures. They're so strong in their hearts and minds, and those continuing the struggle both in China and around the world. We must support them. We lose all moral authority to talk about human rights any place in the world if we are silent in terms of human rights in China and Tibet because of China's size and economy and all the rest. We must support them. We must remember that the spirit of freedom is alive and well, and China's leaders know it and they fear it. They live in fear of it every day with their censorship and imprisonment of men and women like Liu Xiaobo. We will continue the bipartisan call for Liu's release and for greater reforms in China. And the Speaker, Boehner, was with us today as we observed the 25th anniversary, making that observance possible, and we thank him for that. And we acknowledge Congressman Frank Wolf's great leadership on these essential human rights issues. Together, we will continue to fight for progress, democracy, and human rights in China and around the world. And I have been told that not only is a nephew of Xi here, Liu Zhiyu, but her brother is here, Liu Cheng. Is that correct? The brother? So should they both come up while the nephew reads the letter? So in one way or another, hopefully you will be able to extend the wishes of so many people, not just in this room, but across America, who respect Liu Xiaobo, who are concerned about his safety, and who will continue to remind the Chinese government of our respect for Liu Xiaobo. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's an honor to be with you.
This is the This is the Goddess of Democracy, the Democracy Award, which we're giving to you on behalf of Liu Xiaobo, and somehow, Nancy, we're going to get it to him.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Well, you have waited out many dictatorships, and people have come to receive the award, and I know that his family will take it to him. But imagine that these young people modeled this goddess of democracy after our own Statue of Liberty, after our own values that they represent. We cannot turn our backs on that.
And at the
Thank
ceremony today, Nancy and Speaker Boehner announced that an American flag was going to fly atop the Capitol on June the 4th in honor of the people of Tiananmen Square.
Isn't that great? What a great thing. Thank you, Carl, and thank you all to the National Endowment of Democracy, Martin and Ben. Thank you so much for your great leadership and keeping the flame. Thank you. And I'm sorry that we have votes now, but thank you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. This is the Congress. I just want everybody to understand, this is the Congress, and that's how they get things done. And you got to go out of schedule, but we're going to finish. Don't worry. And now I want to ask Liu Xia's nephew, Liu Zhiyu, I got it right. Okay. To give a very, very brief message.
Thank you. It's my I've been here twice already, and thank you. And I just want to say, from my family and from the bottom of our hearts, and thank you so much for all of your support.
Thank you. Thank you. I am going to continue. It's going to only be a minute. I am going to continue because I just want to say to this audience what I was going to say in presenting the tribute to Leader Nancy Pelosi and why we are so very, very privileged to give this award. And Cheng Guangcheng has to make a train, so he's going to have to leave too. But I just want to note that there is no one who is more deserving of this tribute on the 25th anniversary of Tiananmen Square than Liu Xiaobo, because he has been an inspiration, an intellectual and a moral inspiration to all of the people in China who believe in democracy over these past 25 years. And he's just not the principal author of Charter 08, but he put himself forward to be the first person to accept the punishment that everyone expected that the Chinese government would deliver for people who signed Charter 08. And he's been the foremost advocate of the democratic principles contained in the Charter, never more eloquently stated than in the closing statement of his trial, which is outside, on the table outside, when he said that I look forward to the day when my country is a land of freedom of expression, where different values, ideals, beliefs, political views can both compete with each other and peacefully coexist, and where every citizen can state political views without fear, and where no one can, under any circumstances, suffer political persecution for voicing divergent political views. I hope that I will be the last of China's endless literary inquisitions, and that from now on, no one will be incriminated because of speech. And I want to note that today is really the day when the dissidents in Tiananmen Square started building this goddess of democracy, and tomorrow it was the day when it was unveiled. And when it was unveiled, people were shouting, "Long live democracy." It was just and it became for Ned immediately at that point its worldwide, universal symbol for democracy, and we've given it to democratic activists around the world for the past, since 1989. One final concluding point. The common thread running through the writings of Zhiyong and Liu Xiaobo is the idea of citizenship, taking responsibility for one's life and for the well-being of society. What the New Citizens Movement advocates, Xu said in the closing statement of his trial, which is also outside, and it's a brilliant statement, and I urge you to take it and to read it carefully if you haven't already, is for each and every Chinese national to act and behave as a citizen, to accept our roles as citizens and masters of our country, and not to act as feudal subjects, and to treat these sacred rights to vote, to freedom of speech and religion as more than an everlasting IOU. And at the end of his own closing statement, Liu Xiaobo said that, quote, in order to exercise the right to freedom of speech conferred by the Constitution, one should fulfill the social responsibility of a Chinese citizen. That really is a challenge to all of us. And it is also, I hope, an inspiration that will revive the spirit of democratic conviction, which is what this country is all about. Thank you all very much for coming.